मेरा म्यूज़िक जो है वो बेसिकली वो मेरा आईना है। वो राग का स्ट्रक्चर अपनी जगह है, लेकिन मैं उसको कैसे पेश कर रही हूँ वो तो मेरा अपना है सब कुछ। कोई और बजा रहा है, मतलब ये मैं नहीं बजा रही हूँ, मुझसे नहीं हो सकता ये काम। सुर तो ईश्वर है, सुर का मतलब ही है ईश्वर।
I started to try to, take things out of my fingers, and then I developed technique. There are these connections between the music and the math. Mathematics is more about ambiguity. You can have certain modular arithmetic, if you have a 7-beat cycle. So what kinds of phrases can you span that 7 beats so that you come back to the first beat? Often it is the understanding that mathematics is an exact science and it's all about precision. It's actually not. When you study it further, mathematics is more about ambiguity and the nature of how much is infinity, and questions like how many numbers between 0 and 1 and so on and so forth. They're not precise answers, and so it actually gets into the ambiguous, where certain kinds of mathematics can be used and employed, like even in music, in tabla. You can have certain modular arithmetic, if you have a 7-beat cycle. So what kinds of phrases can you span that 7 beats so that you come back to the first beat, and just like the 7 days of the week, you come back to the day 1. There's all these cycles that we deal with every day, and rhythmic exercises can they bring them into a whole new kind of conversation. Mathematics for me was not something that I was necessarily born with. I was not gifted in math per se. I was in fact a failure in math in high school. Music, however, was something that seemed to be more written for me. It was there, it was something that was within me that needed some form, some expression. And so I kept doing it, and without realizing the mathematics that also is involved in it. Mathematics was a much later realization. It was possibly out of a need to somehow correct the pedagogy that I underwent. And in that rectification, I started to really enjoy the process of deductive reasoning, intelligent inquiry, so on and so forth. And it all seemed to fit together. It was actually my failure at school that led my parents to consult with a few teachers at a parent-teacher meeting. And the teacher suggested that, I was always somehow musically inclined, and that was something where focusing was never a problem. Slowly, the musical world took over. It became a world that I could escape in, and a world that I could understand. Our music, as you know, is not a written music, so there's no medium coming between you and the ear. And so it's direct ear training and vocal training and everything else. And so I started developing a sense of rhythm that was there. It just needed the right kind of platform, and I found it. And it started to grow into an obsession, and then I used to hear tabla solos and things like that, and I could understand what was going on. I started to try to, take things out of my fingers, and then I developed a technique by which I could express those rhythms. And then I just, one day I could take it, and of course, none of this could have happened without the support of my parents. So I said, look, I really need to learn the tabla. And now the question was, with whom? Because I only wanted the best. And I sometimes used to sleep at night just praying for the best, to just somehow come by somehow. And it did. I found a diamond in the rough, and he's now my Ustadji, my teacher, my guru, Ustad Khurshid Hussain, and I found him in Karachi, and he slowly started to take me through this world of music, and he really taught me to listen. And the first thing he told me was that tabla is conversation. What kind of conversation? Well, if my Ustadji starts off and gives me a few syllables of tabla and says, now, the inflections in just that rhythm are all the inflections of our Eastern languages. And so suddenly there's a certain phonetic mind that starts to get engaged. And so Urdu, Sindhi, Punjabi, Gujarati, all the languages of India, Bengali, they all start to somehow make more sense. And their phonetics kind of jive with you. And so you appreciate it, you gain ownership of it, because it's an art that's born from that culture. And so it gives you a reference point. And the same thing actually happened with me in mathematics. I started to realize so much of the history of mathematics, because that was what my forte was, my training was in the history of mathematics. So much of the history of mathematics is rooted in our culture as well, from India and the Middle East and so on and so forth, and all these mathematicians that aren't spoken of today. And so, you know, suddenly in a Western education, things can just seem like they're all starting from Newton and Leibniz and the like. And we lose a sense of our intellectual heroes. Likewise, in music, one realizes how much of a science our music is. What an intellect is required, what kind of an aesthetic and mathematical and spiritual sense is needed to start to conceive of our compositions and our rhythms and so on and so forth. I believe as an educator that the education is in the forming of connections. And all too often the education systems of today, as they are post-industrialist formats, they focus on making the connections for you and merely just passing it on to you. Teachers aren't as interested in your derivation of the formula as opposed to your repeated use of it in all sorts of contrived contexts. So where is the math happening? Well, it's actually in coming up with something original, coming up with something that you can call your own. Even if it is a formula that is well known, the self-discovery of it makes it your own and then makes it more useful and meaningful to you. Just like that in music, you could be taught to memorize a whole lot of things, but unless you're also given the chance to develop some of that repertoire and possibly reinvent it for yourself, that's when you truly grasp it. And so if we make the connections for students, of course they're going to get by, and that's what we're doing. We get them by through these tests and examinations and assessments and degrees and what have you. But there's no real learning happening. The real learning is in making the connections. That goes for music, that goes for mathematics, that goes for the sciences, that goes for anything. And so it's, I think involvement in the arts makes people aware of those connections. And as soon as you are aware of making connections, you start making them, you draw parallels, you start thinking differently, you're a much more responsible member of society, and everything else that follows in making a nation a powerful thing. We can't talk about imagination without talking about what we think creativity is. And creativity, it's a process of free play and exploration and inquiry. And through it, things emerge. Of course, we can't keep everything to just free emergence. So of course, so what is the responsibility of an educator in sparking an imagination? And that is to be a facilitator rather than the sole source of information. So, you know, even our criteria for evaluating the imagination has lost credibility. I mean, how can you evaluate someone's painting, someone's composition? What are the parameters by which you gauge whether they're there or not? And it's the same for mathematics. I think we rely too much on exact answers, things we can rely on. It's more for us, that the ones that are grading these papers profusely, rather than for the students. So nobody's thinking about the child. And obviously, the child ends up learning the ropes and not thinking about others around him or her either. And so slowly you have a situation where independent learning is confused with self-directed learning. They're not the same.